Okay, everyone. Now we're back for the third part of the lecture. We're looking at consolidation. In video one, we would have covered encoding. The second video, we looked at retrieval. And now we're going to look at process of consolidation. So when we think of consolidation, it really refers to that transformative process of taking our new memories that are in a fragile state, which can be disrupted or forgotten or decay, and changing it or transforming it to a permanent state, which can be less resilient, less resistant to disruption. Now, our memories essentially have history, right? What occurred in the past. And right after an event or right after learning has occurred, we could recognize that we remember many details about what happened or what we have learned. But with the passage of time and the accumulation of new information or experiences, some of our memories are actually lost, or they could change the character, they're somewhat modified, and that is what we refer to as some sort of disruption, right? Now, another observation about memory is that while every experience creates the potential for new memories are usually fragile, right? So that means that they are susceptible to decay or modification. So that brings us to the concept of consolidation. So consolidation is defined as the process that transforms new memories from a fragile state in which they can be disrupted to a more permanent state in which they are resistant to disruption. Now, this concept was based on a study by Mueller and Helsinki in the 1900s, who did an experiment in which two groups of participants learned a list of nonsense syllables. So the immediate group learned one list and then immediately learned a second list. The delay group learned the first list and then waited for 6 minutes before learning the second list. Now, when we recall for the first list was measured, participants in the delayed group remembered 48% of the syllables, but participants in the immediate, that means in the group with no delay, they only remembered 28%. So apparently, immediately presenting the second list to the no delay group interrupted the forming of more stable memories than the first. So based on that result, right, the experimenters proposed a term of consolidation. Now, since that initial experiment, researchers have discovered that a great deal about what actually happens, right? So what are the mechanisms that are responsible for consolidation? And they distinguish between two types based on the mechanisms that involve the synapses and neural circuits. So neural circuits are the interconnected group of neurons, and one of the processes that they refer to, right, that facilitate consolidation is synaptic consolidation, right? So this takes place over minutes or hours and involves structural changes to the synapse. Now, on the other hand, systems consolidation takes place over months or even years, and it involves a gradual reorganization of neural circuits within the brain. Now, it's essential for us to consider these two processes operated in tandem, right? And they don't operate independent of each other. That is, they don't operate independent of each other. So the difference between the both is that with synaptic consolidation, this happens much quicker, right? And it happens at the synaptic level of the nervous system, right? So whereas the systems consolidation happens or occurs with the reorganization of neural circuits. So both can occur simultaneously. So synaptic consolidation, that's the one that works rapidly at the level of the synapse, and the other one just operates more slowly at the level of neural circuits, right? But it's not that we engage in one versus the other, but we engage in both simultaneously, but they just occur at varying speeds and varying levels. Now let's look at information storage at the synapse. So according to the idea first proposed by Hebb, learning and memory are represented in the brain by physiological changes that take place at the synapse. So let's assume that a particular experience causes nerve impulses to travel down the axon of a neuron. And when these impulses reach the synapse, neurotransmitters are released onto the neuron. Now, Hebb's idea was that repeated activity can strengthen the synapse by causing structural changes, greater transmitter release, and increased firing. Now, Hebb proposed that changes that occur in the hundreds or thousands of synapses that are activated around the same time by one particular experience provide a neural record of the experience. For example, if you recall your experience last New Year's Eve, according to this idea, it is represented in the synapse by a pattern of structural changes across many synapses. Now, one of the outcomes of the structural changes at the synapse is the strengthening of synaptic transmission. Now, this strengthening results in a phenomenon called long-term potentiation, which is just enhanced firing of neurons after repeated stimulation. Now, long-term potentiation is illustrated by firing records, and we can see that in the diagram in 7.1, which is also in your textbook, or which came, I should say, came from your textbook. Yes, so one of the outcomes of the structural changes in the synapse is the strengthening of synaptic transmission. And as we mentioned before, this results in long-term potentiation. As illustrated in figure 7.1. So the first time a neuron is stimulated, right, neuron B will fire slowly. However, after repeated stimulation, it fires much more rapidly at the same stimulus. So we see first when it's presented, right, it is firing, but with continued presentation of the stimulus, it fires even more. And then after many repetitions, more complex connections have developed between the neurons, which causes an increase in the firing rate, even though the stimuli that we are exposed to is the same stimuli as presented in diagram A or figure A. Now, there are different models to explain consolidation. First, we could talk about the standard model of consolidation. Right, so the standard model of consolidation proposes that memory unfolds according to a sequence of events. So the first sequence of events would be the connection between the cortex and the hippocampus, which is initially very strong, right? And as time passes, activity occurs between the hippocampus and the cortex in a process they refer to as reactivation. And over time, connections are formed between the cortical areas and the connections between the cortex. And then the purpose or the utility of the hippocampus progressively weakens and eventually vanishes. Now, this model was partially based on observations of memory loss caused by head trauma or injury. And it's well known that head trauma, like experience with fighters or American football players, when they take like a hard hit, could cause memory loss. Thus, oftentimes, as a player sitting on the bench after receiving an impact or a fighter takes a blow to the head during a fight, he or she may not be aware of what happened in the seconds or minutes before getting hit. Now, this loss of memory for events that occurred before the injury is called retrograde amnesia. Now, this could go back for minutes, hours, or even years, and it depends on the nature and severity of the injury. Now, in figure, we see on the table figure 7.6, we could see it illustrates the characteristics of retrograde amnesia, which is called graded amnesia. So this is amnesia that tends to be the most severe for events that happen just before the injury and to become less severe for earlier events. Now, the gradual decrease in amnesia corresponds, according to the standard model, to the changes in connections between the hippocampus and the cortical areas of the brain. So as time passes after an event, connections between the cortical areas are formed and strengthened, and the connections between the hippocampus and the cortex is weakened and they eventually vanish. Now, within the standard model of consolidation, right, the hippocampus, as we mentioned before, is strongly active when memories are first formed and initially recalled, but less involved as memories are consolidated, so that as memories become more permanent. Eventually, the connections between the cortical areas, right, are sufficient enough to retrieve remote memories. Right. So another model to explain consolidation is the multiple trace mode of consolidation. So according to the multiple trace model of consolidation. Apologies. So according to the multiple trace model of consolidation, the hippocampus is involved in retrieval of episodic memories, even if they originated a long time ago. Now, evidence for this idea comes from experiments done by Gilboa and colleagues, who elicited recent and remote episodic memories by showing participants photographs of themselves engaging in various activities that were taken at times ranging from very recent to the distance past, like to when they were children. The results of this experiment show that the hippocampus was activated during the retrieval of both recent and remote episodic memories. And we can see this is different to what was suggested by the systems consolidation model, which indicated that hippocampus or the activity in the hippocampus reduces after the memories become more permanent. Okay. Now, there is some evidence, right, on factors or a single factor, I should say, talking about sleep specifically, assisting with consolidation. So there's evidence that consolidation is enhanced during sleep. However, memory for the task is stronger. Subjects expected that they will be tested. So typically, if persons think that they're being tested, we know that they may engage in more elaborative processing or be more intentional in recalling the information. But just by the natural process without that conscious awareness of being tested, sleep seems to enhance the consolidation process. So when we sleep after learning, memories that are more important are more likely to be strengthened by consolidation. Now, we could question here, are memories ever permanent? And when we talked about long-term memory initially last week, we would have said that, long-term memory is essentially permanent. And if we have difficulty or problems recalling or remembering information, it's more an issue with the retrieval process. Right? So recent research on rats first and then on humans has suggested a possible mechanism for updating memories. These experiments support the idea that when a memory is retrieved, it becomes fragile, as it was when it was originally formed, and that when it is in that fragile state, it needs to be consolidated again. And this process is what they term reconsolidation. Now, the reason this is important is that when the memory has become fragile again, and before it has been reconsolidated, it could be changed or eliminated. So according to this idea, retrieving a memory not only puts us in touch with something that happened in the past, but it also opens the door for either modifying or forgetting memory. Now, this in itself has a lot of clinical implications, especially for persons who would have experienced trauma. I mean, there's an unfortunate consequence of we could be recalling an incident in childhood, like a fond memory, and in discussing that fond memory, we can oftentimes getting someone else's point of view, and that can lead to revisions of the memory. But if we think about it, or think about a clinical application, this could be very helpful for persons who experience trauma. So one of the practical outcomes of research on reconsolidation is possible treatment of persons who are diagnosed with PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. So this typically, if you're not familiar with PTSD, it is essentially a condition that occurs when persons experience a traumatic event. They may, up to six weeks after the event, they could receive that diagnosis if they experience flashbacks from the experience or have nightmares, other physical symptoms, and extreme anxiety. So Brunette and colleagues in 2008 tested the idea that the reactivation of a memory followed by reconsolidation could actually help alleviate these symptoms. So this method involves reactivating the person's memory for the traumatic event, and then they administer a drug, propranolol, and this drug actually blocks the activation of stress hormone receptors in the amygdala, and that we know that the amygdala is a part of the brain that is important to determining the emotional components of a memory, and is also associated with more intense emotions, like fear, for example. Now, research on reconsolidation, and its potential applications is just in the early stages because this was first initially suggested in 2008. But what researchers have learned so far is that it appears that our memory is not static or fixed. So while we may be able to recall an event, the actual details of it may not be permanent. So it's rather more so a work in progress, something that could be continuously revised, recreated, right, or edited. Okay. So now we're going to look at just overall some techniques that we can employ to improve learning and memory. So one is elaboration. So elaboration is a process that helps transfer the material that you're reading into long-term memory. So this is like thinking about what you're reading and giving meaning to it by relating it to other things that you know. This becomes easier as you learn more because you have learned, because what you have learned creates a kind of structure within your brain and allows to hold on to new information. Next is to generate and test, so the generation effect, which we talked about before. And this is essentially generating and testing the information you would have revised. So you're taking an active role in creating the material, and by you taking an active role is a very powerful way to achieve strong encoding and good long-term retrieval of information. Next is the organization of information, and we mentioned this before, creating some sort of structure or organization of material or content could allow you to encode the information more efficiently and effectively and also retrieve that information. Another factor is taking breaks. So memory is better for multiple short study sessions. So essentially the spacing effect is more effective for you to, for example, study for 30 minutes and take a 50-minute break and then continue rather than trying to do a 3-hour session continuously. Also, taking rest or sleeping, right, could be very effective. So while we may think all-nighters may be efficient. It's not really efficient, right? For you to remember that information or for consolidation to occur for the memory to be more permanent, it will be in your best interest to rest or take or to sleep in between study sessions. Also, it's important to avoid the illusion of learning. So oftentimes we may believe we encoded information, right, because it's familiar to us, but it doesn't mean that we fully understand or comprehend that information. So essentially, tools that you could use as students to help with studying would be to practice the information, take breaks, and also to make sure you have that information as organized as possible to facilitate effective and efficient encoding of information. All right, so that brings us to the end of the third section of this lecture. So we would have covered encoding, retrieval, and consolidation. Okay. As usual, I will have notes available on this topic and some practice multiple choice questions, right? You need to practice that retrieval of the information you have read.